Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Open Road, a video cast where we look at various aspects of the open source ecosystem, communities, best practices, and anything that has to do with bettering open source and open source communities. My name is Brian Proffitt. I am with the Open Source Program Office at Red Hat, and I am here with my good friend and colleague, Rich Bowen.
I'm Rich Bowen, and I'm also with the Open Source Program Office at Red Hat.
So here's the thing. Rich and I have been friends for a very long time, and we have often talked about the different ways that we each approach open source. Rich, for those of you who don't know, has a long and storied history with open source projects. You want to talk a little bit about your background real quick, Rich?
Yeah, I've been doing open source for 20 some years, and most of that time I've been involved with the Apache Software Foundation. Started out in the Apache Web Server project. I've served on the board, and right now I am the person in charge of running our conferences.
Which, that is impressive right then and there. But then in his day job, tell him what you do, Rich.
I am the community manager for the CentOS project, which some of you may have heard of. Now, Brian, on the other hand, Brian's been around tech for a long time and was a trusted reporter for many years. Tell us what you do now.
So right now, I work on the Community Insights team with the Open Source Program Office, and our team is one of those small but mighty teams where we are doing knowledge gathering and information analysis. So part of the team's responsibility is building curriculums for people so we can train people on how to do best practices around community open source. And the other side of that equation is we're constantly looking at ways to analytically monitor and report on the health of open source communities. So it's a really neat job, and I'm totally a numbers geek, so I'm enjoying that part of it too.
Now, those of us that have been around open source for a long time, and you've probably seen this yourself, we kind of made it up as we went along over the past 20 years. And one of the things that we've observed in the last decade, well, probably longer than that, is that there are people emerging in open source who are actual trained experts. And we decided that it would be really cool to talk to some of these people and find out what we got right and what we got wrong. And this podcast series is about that.
And where better to start with the whole examination of how to do open source and open source project management the best possible way is talking about how do you get people involved in the project. And as we move through this series, we'll talk about different elements of open source community management and best practices and on down the line. So look forward to hearing things about, how do you handle governance? How do you handle elections? How do you handle diversity and inclusion? There's a lot to cover in this series, but as Rich said, we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to start at the very fundamental question of what is onboarding. Because we've been around a long time, we've had our way of doing it, but it turns out that this question has a lot of different answers. So
when we first started having this conversation, we thought that we would do an episode on onboarding. And we ended up with so much material that I think this is 5, 6 episodes. There's quite a lot of content here, and we've broken it up into smaller sub-questions. The first expert that we talked to was Mary Thengvall.
So my name is Mary Thengvall. I am the Director of Developer Relations at Carmunda. We are a process automation platform, open source. We've got a great developer community, and I help the team make our product more accessible, enable developers to get onboarded more easily, provide resources for them, all of those fun things.
We asked Mary, what do you consider the fundamental mandatory parts of onboarding?
So there's a couple things there. I think mandatory is making sure that there is some sort of documentation that tells someone, here's where I download the software, or here's where I sign up for my free version. Here's how I get started. Here's the first thing that I need to do. So there needs to be some sort of documentation to make sure that people know, A, how to access the right tooling, and B, what they do once they've gotten that far. And it's always amazing to me how many companies, how many organizations take documentation as a lower priority, and see it as something that, well, the product got released, we'll get to the documentation later. And people seem to miss that step of, well, the product can be excellent, but if no one knows how to use it, you aren't going to have much luck finding customers, finding users, finding people who are interested in coming back and trying again. And I think there's such a crucial moment, especially for developers, where they form that first impression of your software. And you can always make things better later on, but the chances of someone who's already tried it and realized that's difficult to start with, it doesn't work well, there's no documentation, there's not an easy path to onboard, the chances of them actually coming back to try again are very slim.
So I love this answer because I have obviously a lot of writing and documentation experience, and for me, documentation is a great way of getting things really well organized and also scaled, because you don't have to depend on a single person or group of people to definitely handle the onboarding process. If you write it down, it's easier to share.
The other side of this is this kind of mirrors my onboarding. My initial experience with open source was through the documentation. And I find that I learn best by writing and by teaching. And so I started, the project that I started with first was the Apache web server, and the documentation was not great. And I was encouraged to go make it better. And that experience was very positive for me, because I learned so much while improving the documentation. But the fact that there was documentation that got me up and running fast enough was a great start.
I think a lot of us had a similar experience when we first got into open source. I would be curious to hear how it works for people who are just now recently in open source, because we have things like Stack Overview and all of these different really robust mailing lists and forums now that in my day, not to sound like that, it was really hard to find information. And I know this because I was one of the books who was writing books about this stuff. That's how I made my living, because just had to make the documentation up as you went.
A point that Mary makes here is that your first experience with a piece of software is so important. And if your first experience is bad, chances are you're not going to have a second experience. When there's so much diversity of choice in open source these days, you go read an article and you find the top 5 whatever, and you try them, and you probably never look at 4 of them ever again, because you pick the one that works for you and the rest of them you forget about. So yeah, that first experience is really important.
We broached this question with other people, and one of the people we talked to was Deb Nicholson. And Deb Nicholson is currently the acting general manager of the Open Source Initiative. And Deb, if you've not had the pleasure of meeting her, is an amazing human being, just like Mary, of course. But Deb is, one of those people who has very clear ideas on what it means to be an active and engaged member of open source and free software communities. So when we put the question to her, this is what she had to say.
Oh, that's interesting, because it's really different for staff than it is for volunteers, although there is, of course, some overlap. like for staff, you have to make sure people know like when their timesheets are due, like all that super, like, am I allowed to take sick days, all the nuts and bolts stuff. For volunteers, you don't have to do that, but I think the interesting overlap is you want to give people like kind of a big picture of the organization so that there are fewer surprises. So if I bring someone in, then I say, like, once you get to this area of our work, you're going to be talking with Sally. And if you end up going over here, then you're going to get an email from Ethan, and so that people are never surprised. They don't think like, oh no, I messed up because email, I got an email from Ethan. It's like, no, 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 that's normal. You get that when you push up a patch. Um, and so really trying to give people as much of a, like, here's how we do things, and um so that big picture, but then on the small picture, like kind of the behaviors that we like to see. And sometimes you have to really work against I guess maybe people's trauma from other volunteering experiences or workplaces, and say it's really okay to ask questions. I would so prefer, even if you type something, we talk on video call, and then like 4 minutes later you're like, I forgot to ask. And just saying, giving those kinds of examples, like I always want those, and it's totally fine. If you get stuck and you told me, oh, this is going to take me 2 weeks, and then you get in and everything explodes into 19 subtasks, just let me know. It's fine. I'm not going to hold you to that 2 weeks because you didn't understand what you were going to encounter when you got in. So sometimes, and not every workplace or project has always been good at that. So that's one of those ones where you have to really say, like, hey, I know the default might not be a very healthy communicative style, but we encourage that here, and we like it.
Are you sort of like under the school of thought where you would do like, you give them the broad parameters for the task and then ultimately let them free, or do you take a more regimented approach to making sure that they're in scope?
And I think it depends on the complexity of the task.
Mm-hmm.
So, as much as possible for folks when they're learning a new thing, I try to break tasks down into smaller tasks and kind of say, like, okay, so first you'll research this, and then you'll make a draft, and then you'll do this. And then kind of try to hear, like, tell me back, like, what we just kind of agreed that you do. And then if they're like, and then my horrible writing will go right out on the internet, and it's like, no, you'll send me a draft and I'll give you some feedback. And maybe the next time you do this, I'll give you some feedback, but I'll tell you why, so that each time you'll be able to guess what kind of feedback I was going to give you anyway. And you'll need less of my fingers all over your work. So my goal is to, like, help people feel comfortable with the things that are new to them, and be explicit, and always be explaining, like, oh, we don't capitalize that because it's, whatever, that's just our style guide. So I have marked it on your first document, but next time I will just expect you to always mark it because I've told you why we do it. And then eventually get to a place where it's like, yeah, just go with it and do it, and let me know. I do try to, I guess, give parameters and say, like, so here's one of those weird edge cases where you may not have the organizational, like, biggest picture or all the history to decide, like, is this the yes pile or the no pile? Let me know if you hit anything like that, and we'll talk through it.
So you kind of touched on the fact that it's different for staff versus volunteers. And of course, we're primarily interested in open source projects where the majority of people are going to be volunteers. What's the big difference in your mind between what you would do for staff and what you would do for volunteers?
So for staff, I do kind of like to let folks know, like, hey, so we're paying for this part of the work, and these are the ways in which these are the kind of touch points of accountability that we're looking for. So I expect this cadence of work. And that's something that you can do with someone who's paid for a regular number of hours, you know, to do a certain volume of work. And you say,
Mhm.
like, so we're looking for this cadence, I'm looking for like this quality, this length, this amount of care, etc. And just kind of like always reiterating, like, that's the expectation. That's what we're paying for. So we never lose track of like, oh, that's, you ended up over there. I guess it's my fault for not telling you anything for like 6 weeks. Um, so you never want to have that. Whereas like with volunteers, the amount of time that they have is going to be really different. So it's like a lot looser on time frames. So I might say, like, oh, Brian, so if you want to work on this, we would need it by the end of April. If that doesn't sound like something you can
Mhm.
do, then I could give you a piece of it, or I could find something else for you to work on. So whereas with a paid staff person, I'm like, if you think you're not going to be able to do this by April, I need it. It's like, and this is the cadence of things that we do here in the timelines.
So clearly, we are seeing Deb's background in organizational management within the free and open source software ecosystem. That was super clear in the way she approached the question. I mean,
Yeah, and this is something I really appreciated about her answer was, I mean, it's the reason that we asked these particular people to come talk to us, because they were able to give us a perspective from outside of our bubble. And so often, I suppose this is true of any industry, but we invent processes for doing things and we ignore the existing wisdom that's existed for centuries in other industries. And seeing this kind of, seeing the way that she approaches management is really helpful, because it all applies just slightly differently when you're dealing with an open source project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way, and this is really important because it can almost apply to, it applies to outside organizations, or I shouldn't say outside, I'm sorry, non-corporate organizations like the Open Source Initiative or the Free Software Foundation or any of these other meta organizations that have, the staff people and the volunteer people. And clearly, a lot of what Deb is saying definitely applies to that, but it can also translate well over into like the quote corporate side. So you have, people who are paid employees working on a project versus volunteers working on the project. And the division of labor is very real and very there. And how you approach, they work is certainly key. But Deb is saying you should make the differentiation as early as the onboarding process, which I really found helpful because it kind of helped me answer some of the questions I've been having lately about how do we balance, open source projects and how they focus on volunteer efforts versus corporate efforts. So yeah, a lot to unpack there.
There were two things in particular that I heard this time that didn't strike me before, and the first of those was how important it is to tell the new folks the big picture. It's not just, I'm going to have you filling out this form or assembling this sprocket. It's understanding the mission, the big picture, why they're here, why it matters, how their work impacts other parts of the organization. And that's not necessary for their job, but it's necessary for them feeling like they're making a difference, that what they do matters in the larger organization. If all you do is come to work every day and you do your little job and you don't pay any attention to the rest of the organization, it starts to feel pretty pointless after a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's such a nice thing for just like simple things like motivation, by understanding what the larger picture is, because some of this work is not fun. Sure. Filling out spreadsheets might be fun for me, but it's not, data entry or what might be called mundane tasks is not always, a roaring party.
But they're necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
and they're necessary. And if you understand where they are in the bigger picture, as you say, then the work becomes more meaningful and more valuable, and you feel like you've made a difference, which, I believe is why quite a few people come to open source in the first place.
So the second thing that Deb mentioned that really struck me this time is something that we're terrible at in open source, and that is gradually stepping back. She talked about how the first time you give someone a task to do, you hover over their shoulder and you redline what they got wrong. And the next time you kind of let them handle it themselves. And then the next time they're on their own. And this is something that in open source, we tend to be bad at. We tend to never step away. We tend to never relinquish ownership. And you find in so many projects that somebody owns a particular thing. And when someone else steps up to volunteer, they're squished, not because their help isn't welcome, but because the owner doesn't ever want to let go.
Yeah, and it's a really tough nut to crack too, because sometimes it's not a malignant, motivation to do that. Sometimes
no, it's
people,
passion. It's love for the thing.
It's passion, it's love for the thing. Sometimes, like when it happens to me, sometimes it's, I feel like it would take longer to train somebody than it would be to just do it myself, which again speaks to my control freakiness a little bit. So, I'll own that, but I'm not intending to be malicious about it.
Sure.
But, even things like that, we're all human, we're all imperfect. It comes out in different ways. And, as she was describing that, I could easily see Deb doing that for new people. In fact, she sort of has done it for me when I was first coming into the free software ecosystem, and I first met her, and she did a brilliant job of explaining like what was going on, where the interconnectivities were with the politics and the organizations that were involved. And she was just always there as a resource, but she knew when to step back. She knew I had to tell a story in my job as a journalist, and she wasn't trying to tell the story for me. And so I know for experience, she practices what she preach. And that's an excellent observation, because she's really good at that.
I wonder if we might come back to this in some later discussion. It feels like it fits in somewhere. This notion that when someone's a volunteer, you can't compel them to put in a particular amount of time or work to a deadline. And what's interesting to me about this, and we touched on this in one of the other interviews that we did that will not be included in this episode. But the fact that there's so much, that there's this movement from purely volunteer to mostly full-time hired employees working on software projects these days. And so we, as the consumer of the project, do expect those folks to work to a deadline. We do expect them to fix the security problems the day we report them. We expect them to get their releases out on time.
Some of the more successful strategies that I've seen around that have been, what Deb first mentioned when she started answering the question is you paint this bigger picture. You explain what the end goal is, so that the volunteer knows what's at stake. If they know what's at stake, I believe it becomes a lot more interesting to, or motivational rather, for them to hit that goal. You're right. There isn't anything you can do to incentivize them beyond their own sense of goodwill. But if they have that picture of, okay, I need to hit this deadline because this is a release date or whatever we're doing, then it becomes a little bit easier. So there are practical reasons beyond just mere, it's nice to talk about that bigger picture.
Do we want to move on to our third interview?
Yes. So again, another brilliant person.
In our third interview, I invited one of my colleagues from work, Sarah Finn, and her job title is Agile Coach, and she works with an internal team to help them know how to work together as a team. And so when we started talking about this topic, she was the obvious person to ask because she has so much expertise in this. So here's what she had to say.
Okay, so if it was somebody onboarding into a brand new team, it's trying to, I suppose, welcome them as best as we can is the biggest thing. And then ensuring that they have information, they have access to the right people, the documentation, that they're aware of when the syncs are and what the goal is of those calls or those meetings, what they hope to gain from them, what the value is in that whole process that the team is working towards. That's for one person onboarding into a team. I would usually have someone shadowing them just to kind of make them feel a little bit comfortable and to create that area of psychological safety as well, whereby they very much feel comfortable in sharing their thoughts, their opinions, because as a new person in a new team, everybody around us are experts. We're newbies into this, so we kind of can naturally kind of shy away from contributing at the start, whereas trying to kind of set stepping stones and towards them contributing as much as they can in a safe environment. When a team is forming, all the teams are coming together. That's a team kind of onboarding into a new process, maybe, of how they're going to work together. So that would be another kind of set of steps you go through there.
Your definition of a psychological safe space, that's interesting because I had not really heard it phrased that way. And on the one hand, it seems fairly obvious, as you said, it's like providing a space where they feel like they can contribute. Have you done any kind of analysis or written this down somewhere, like the things that actually, the goals, specific goals you want to achieve to get to that psychological safe space?
Yes, so it would be something that when I work with teams, different teams have different ways of working and different ways of working together and communicating together. So there'll be different elements across those around psychological safety and things we need to work on. So for example, within an open source team, it's great, to see everyone being very open and transparent and sharing their views around things, which is brilliant. You might not necessarily get that in traditional organizations where it's very much, or I suppose how people speak. I speak to the manager or the higher ups. You wouldn't get that opportunity to do that. Whereas an open organization, you do. But sometimes the lines can get a bit blurry then around what is okay, and how we phrase our opinion, and how we invite others to have that discussion with us can get a little bit blurry. So it's trying to get the team or get the person to absolutely understand that their voice is important and should be heard, but also that they do that in a respectful manner, and that they allow for other people's opinions to be heard as well, and that they're not closed with their own opinion, that they allow other people's thoughts to influence them as well, so become more open in that sense in their mindset, as well as how they communicate as well.
The notion that when you join a team, everyone around you is an expert. And when she said that, I mean, when I was a kid, I moved a lot, right? And my wife moved a lot too. And when you start at a new school, whether or not it's true, you perceive that everyone around you has always been there and has always known each other. Mm-hmm. And then, maybe later you find out, oh, they came the same time I did. But you have this sense of, I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to ask the wrong question because everybody around me already knows this. And I've been at Red Hat for 7 years now, and I still struggle with this. I still struggle with this notion that everyone around me knows all the stuff. And, it often turns out they got here after I did. So establishing this psychological safety, this this notion, yeah, it's okay to ask those questions, is just so important when you're joining a new team, a new project, a new process. I really appreciated that from Sarah, and she actually did a seminar on this several months ago, specifically about this topic, that was just super valuable to me.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was, and I think it's a thing that comes up so often, not just in the corporate world, or as you said, in the educational world, when you're, all ages. It really comes up a lot in the open source world because, we're not a bunch of vagabonds, but there is a lot of movement running around because people get different interests and they get different skills and they move on to different projects. And so even veteran developers will come in new to a project and won't know all the ins and outs of what's going on with this project. Yes, they might know how to code, or some other common form of skill, but they may not get the community because it's like moving to a new job or a new school.
Yeah.
There are weird things about anything new like that.
And traditionally in open source, our response to newcomers has been, just go read the documentation, go do your homework, go figure this out. Mm-hmm. We don't have time to bring you up to speed on this. And what I love about the way that Sarah works on her team, and our Mary and Deb have talked about this as well. Being intentional about making people feel welcome is something that many people that have been around open source for a while are kind of leery of. It's all touchy feeling. It's not something that we do in tech. Mm-hmm. And so I appreciate this perspective and doing this intentionally.
Yeah. One of the other things that I noticed that Sarah did, she neatly combined two of the things that our previous guests had talked about, where, she had said, we provide documentation, we make sure everything's written down. And at the same time, we help the newcomer to the team understand the bigger picture and their value within it. Which is something that both of our previous guests had kind of done. And Sarah's just like, yep, that's part of it too. And I loved how it wasn't just like, here's the bigger picture. It was also the other side where it was like, here's how you're valued in that bigger picture. That to me bridges the connection. And it's not to say the previous answers were incomplete by any means, but it was just like, when you put it like that, I thought it was really meaningful and telling, and certainly with like all the advice that our guests have given, it was amazingly useful.
Now we've kind of cherry picked these little sections out of larger videos, and so there is much more to come as we keep talking about this topic of onboarding. There's more depth, and we're looking forward to sharing that with you as well.
We certainly are. So stay tuned. Feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and so you'll get further updates on when we release additional episodes of The Open Road. Until then, my name is Brian Proffitt.
And I'm Rich Bowen.
Have a great and safe day.